Hello girls, last class we started with the Roman invasion, the contribution of the Roman Empire, and towards the end we also talked about Christianity, how the Roman soldiers brought along with them their faith, that is Christianity, and how Christians, even though they were persecuted, you do find Roman soldiers, they did adopt this religion and it was spread to wide parts of the world. It was scattered, nevertheless, you find the influence of Christianity on literature as well. And we have to understand the story of Helena and her invention of the true cross. And there is also the legend of Saint Albin. Now, I had asked you to study and understand the story of Helena and her invention of the true cross. Helena is actually mother of Constantine. Now, even though she was known as the mother of Constantine, you have to understand she had a very humble sort of birth, and her name is associated in the history of church with the legend that she had actually found the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. So you have to understand that there was this increased reverence for the cross as a symbol of Christian belief, that is during the Constantine period. But all we know is that during this period, only this rock of Golgotha, the holy sepulchre, and the new basilica of Constantine. These are the only things that we know about. But you understand that Constantine had actually allowed his mother, or she took on pilgrimage, holy pilgrimage, and during this pilgrimage, she came across the true cross. So, and later on, of course, fragments of the cross was found, and immediately, wherever these fragments were found, a basilica was built, and you find this resulted in this invention of the discovery of the cross, and this was celebrated. This was celebrated as a festival for the dedication of the Constantine's new building. So these were the circumstances of the discovery and Helena's role. There are other stories, of course, where she basically touched. She was sick, and she touched each cross. And when she touched the third cross, she recovered, and she immediately declared that that cross was holy. So there are a lot of stories, but you find that this did enter, this did feature, and this did enter the story or the literature of. Now the other stories would be Ellen by Wolf. So that is how you pronounce it. It's Wolf. Now talking about place names. So in spite of the Roman occupation of Britain for a long period of 4 centuries, you understand that the Roman occupation of Britain did not really uh, leave any kind of lasting impression. And you find that beyond few ruins and a few words of Latin origin, like the place name endings with suffixes with Chester, Castor, and Cester, as in Dorchester, Lancaster, and Gloucester. So now these are, I would say, some of the contributions, real contributions. Now there are supposed to be forms of the Latin word castra. The word castra actually means fort. So this was mainly because of the relationship between Rome and Britain was that of the ruler and the ruled, the conqueror and the conquered. So you find that the Roman legions, they were posted in Britain to safeguard the land. So Rome did not actually take root there. So they were just there for a temporary period. And you find that these soldiers they were allowed to stay in the land for a designated time. There was some sort of a rotation. So none of the soldiers were there in the land long enough to form any kind of a lasting attachment. And you find that Rome, even though Rome tried to impose her laws, her language, and customs, the so-called Britons, they remained completely different, or they were not completely overtaken by the so-called Roman customs, language, or laws. So Rome accepted nothing from Britain except her subjugation. So as a result, when the Roman troops were withdrawn from Britain, the land returned to its pre-Roman existence, with each tribe fighting with the others. So when it's so funny that even though when the Romans came and they literally gave them what they desired, the best gift, that is Pax Romana or peace, you find that it did not really have much of a sort of a change in so-called Britons, because the moment the Roman legions, they left the land, the so-called Romanized Britons too, they relapsed into their original form. That is, they went back into their pre-Roman existence. They again went back into their original or their previous state, where each tribe, would fight with the other tribes. And now, meanwhile, we also have to understand what was happening in Rome during this period. So now, in the third century of the Christian era, so now in terms of place names, this is they did. Now, let us understand what is happening in Rome during this period. Now, in Rome during this period, there were a lot of changes that were taking place. In the third century of the Christian era, the Roman Empire was slowly beginning to decline. It was beginning to totter. Now, there are several reasons for this decline. So, let us understand what they are. Now, one cause for its decline was the weakness of central authority. You need a good ruler. We need somebody at the center to manage, and that too, such a huge empire. So, one of the reasons for the decline of the Roman Empire was the central authority. That is the first point. Next, the Roman government had become a despotism and a successful government depending upon an able despot. So you find that the Roman government basically relied on an able despot. So even though when we think about despots, we think about someone as ruthless and powerful and cruel as a dictator, but it relied on such an able despot. Now, the rulers of Rome were despots, but not all of them were very able ones, and therefore the power of the empire began to decline. So, we need one true, a magnificent ruler to keep everyone in line. Now, that did not happen all the time. There were very few able despots. All the others were not all that powerful. So another just as important reason for the decline of Rome the was the fact that the people of Rome had become pampered and indolent. So even though the Roman legions, they were quite disciplined, you find that the Roman civilians, the Romans, I would say the Romans were not fighting. The Romans were leading a luxurious life. They got used to this luxurious life. Their lifestyle had changed altogether. They began to lead a very carefree, uh, luxurious, pampered, lazy life. And it is because of this luxury, and you find there was absolutely no concept of morality. So they were very immoral at that point. So it is luxury, immorality, and their earlier, this disciplined lifestyle that they had given way to this moral laxity. They were too pampered, they were lazy, they become very immoral, and this, of course, gave way to a sort of lawlessness. They were more focused on their lust, and this was basically some sort of a disease. This can be seen as some sort of a disease which was eating into their success. So, this is again another factor which resulted in the decline of the Roman Empire. So, this cancer that was gnawing at them, combined with the lack of proper leadership, made them unable to beat back the savage attacks of a host of tribes. And during this time, you find there were a lot of attacks. There were a lot of sporadic attacks from tribes from other parts of Europe, that is the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, and the Anglo-Saxons and Jews. So they all began to attack Rome, and it was easy for them to attack and somehow disturb the so-called unity of the Romans, because the Romans have basically become quite lazy. So they burst into Gaul, who these tribes, that is the Goths, Franks, Vandals, Anglo-Saxons, and Jews, they burst into Gaul. Gaul, once again, let me remind you, is France. They burst into Gaul and Spain, driving all before them, and settled in large numbers with their families in the lands they conquered. By the first quarter of the 5th century, they set their sights upon Rome herself, and a huge army of Goths, led by their king Alaric. Please remember these names, girls. But Alaric sacked the capital city of Rome in 410 AD. Now, this was a moment of crisis for the Romans, because you find that these tribes, they had these host of tribes, they were quite powerful, and they included the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, and the Anglo-Saxons, of course. And they basically got into France and Spain, and they settled down. And once they settled down in the lands where they had conquered, they began to set their eyes on Rome. And by 410 AD, the capital city of Rome was sacked by the Goth, the huge army of Goth, and the army of Goths were led by their king Alaric. So you find that it was very difficult for the Romans to, defeat this group of Goths, and to fight against Goths, they needed soldiers. They needed enough soldiers. And this is the reason why Emperor, at that point, the Emperor was Honorius. So Emperor Honorius could not really face this situation. So what he had to do, was supposed to do, was he had to withdraw the Roman legions. Remember, Roman legions were posted in Britain. So he recalled the Roman legions were now posted in parts of Europe. So the Roman legions were forced to leave Britain, and now Britain, after all, the Britain were now on their own. So you have to remember, once they experienced Pax Romana, the Romanized Britons, they settled down peacefully. They really did not have any kind of protection at all. And this crisis from 410 AD, which resulted in the withdrawal of the Roman soldiers, left the so-called Britons vulnerable. They did not really have any proper defense. This was the situation. So let us once again look at The main contributions, these are the main contributions to the Roman invasion. Now, as you can see, after the Roman soldiers left the land, they were left defenseless, and this made it very easy for the tribes, the other tribes, so the next set of invaders to come and invade Britain. So the next set of invaders to land and invade would be the Anglo-Saxons. Now, Anglo-Saxons, even though we call them Anglo-Saxons, they basically consist of three groups of invaders. They were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Jutes or Jutland warriors. Jutland warriors were the first set to come and invade the land. So now there is a story behind how they came to occupy the land. So now let us understand what happened. With the departure of Rome from the shores of Britain, the people of the land, they were left to fend for themselves. They had to somehow manage. They had to manage their lives. And the Roman culture, which had been theirs for the previous century, was no protection against the many tribes and groups eager to overrun the land. So all the so-called contributions of the Romans, that is from the baths to um, the market, the theatre, all that did not really help in the protection of the Britons. And you find very soon there were tribes and groups that were eager to, occupy and plunder the so-called the Romanized Briton area. And you find Britons, they had to face the attacks of both loads of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes and Danes from Europe eager to plunder and conquest. You find there were a lot of tribes who were targeting Britain. Now, these were tribes from other places, that is mainly from outside the land. Now, closer to home, that is within Britain itself, you remember the Picts and Scots girls? Now, closer to home, you find the Picts and Scots who were basically isolated. They were pushed to the further corners of north. Now, what they did was they broke through the Hadrian wall. Remember, there were two lines of fortification, or there were two walls built to keep these Picts and Scots away. One is the Hadrian wall, and the other is the Antoine wall. So now the Picts and Scots, they broke through the Hadrian wall, they looted and they plundered the land and the people. Now the Britons, though lacking in military training strategy, they did not want for courage or brave leaders. So even though they did not have proper military training, because during the Roman invasion they were and Pax Romana, they had led a very easy sort of a life. So they did not really have any kind of formal military training. But that did not mean that they were not courageous or they were not brave. They did have few leaders. Now the Britons, they took up arms for the motherland under the leadership of the Welsh bishop Saint Germanus. And in 429 AD, the Britons won a victory called the Hallelujah Victory, as it was won by the efforts of the bishop. So now under the Welsh bishop Saint Germanus, in 429 AD, the Britons, they actually won against their enemy, and this war or this battle, it is known as the Hallelujah victory. Hallelujah victory because uh, they were able to win only because of this bishop, and that is why it is known as the Hallelujah victory. But now you find the Britons, they could not really defend themselves against Picts and Scots, because remember they used to have a different kind of warfare altogether. They were quite unpredictable, and they were very difficult to manage or control them. Now, because the Picts and Scots were really difficult to manage or hold off, you find in 450 AD a British chief named Vortigern. So you find a British chief named Vortigern. So we have to understand that during this period, uh, the British chief was Vortigern, and what he did was he believed that Picts and Scots would be too much for them to handle. So they enlisted, they literally invited the Jutland warriors. There were two Jutland warriors, one whose name was Hengist and the other was named Horsa. So the British chief Vortigern, he enlisted the help of two Jutland warriors, one is Hengist and Horsa. So they asked for help. They asked Hengist and Horsa to help them defeat the Picts and Scots. So this is what happened. Now, this automatically led to the invasion, because it is almost like giving the key to the thief. Because when the Jutland warriors, since they were invited, when they came, they found it very easy. They found it very easy to defeat the Picts and Scots. And once they defeated, that is Hengist and Horsa, they were able to defeat Picts and Scots. But then they did not want to really go back. So they decided to invade the land. So you find the first set of invaders who were actually invited to come over were the Jutland warriors. So the first group would be the Jutland warriors or the Jews. So the next set of invaders were the Jews. Now, when we talk about invasions, after the Roman invasion, the next set of invaders were the Anglo-Saxons. So Anglo-Saxon, when we look at the timeline, it is from 455 to 600 AD. Please remember, girls, 455 to 600 AD. That is the timeline of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. So the 200 years between the movement or the withdrawal of the Roman legions and the coming of the Roman missionary, they are extremely important to the historian, because this during this period that they believe that the English race came to exist. So after the withdrawal of the Roman army, you find that there was a temporary pause. There was a temporary pause to the so-called civilization. Remember, when the Romans came, they basically civilized this tribe called the Britons, because prior to the Romans, if you think about the kind of group of people that were living there, that is the uncivilized barbaric Celts. And then after the Roman invasion, what happened to the so-called people there? You have to understand there was a slow but a very definitive sort of a change. They had become quite civilized. They were known as Romanized Britons. So you find that prior to the Roman army, there was violence and anarchy everywhere. Savagery and brutality was the order of the day. So now the record of this period was written, or you would find records in the form of writings of two monks. There are two monks and they are known as Gildus and Nennius. So now they consider the travails of Britons a fitting punishment from God for their disorderly ways. Writing from a very subjective perspective, these works cannot be considered as an unbiased view of all that happened in those days. Nennius himself claims no authenticity for this statement. So even though Gildas and Nennius, they can be considered, I believe, the first ones to have written about uh, this group, that is the Britons. But when they wrote about the Britons, they did not really write like a historian would. That is, they were not unbiased, but rather they were extremely subjective and biased. So you cannot really consider them as true historians, even though their accounts were the first and the original ones. But the best account for those days was written much later by the Venerable Bede. So Venerable Bede, in his very famous work, you have to remember this entire name. His work is called The Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation. So it is this ecclesiastical history of the English nation, which was written in the year 732 AD, and this was followed after a century by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, these two works are called or are known as the objective accounts of the events of the time. So, when you talk about history, first piece of written history would be these two, that is the most famous ecclesiastical history of the English nation in the year 732 AD, and a century later you have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And you find that the history of those times is supported and corroborated by the archaeological findings in the 20th century. So, the 20th century, there were archaeological findings, and these archaeological findings basically support whatever was written in these two works, that is the ecclesiastical as well as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, basically rendering them to be true accounts. So, factual and true accounts. So, you have to remember these two works, girls. Venerable Bede. Venerable Bede is known for his. So now the history of those times is further supported and corroborated by the archaeological findings in the 20th century. Now, some of the archaeological sites of England were the burial grounds of the early Anglo-Saxons. Now, it was possible to locate these by a study of place names. Now, for instance, there are a number of place names which end in the suffix ing or ings. So you find when the Anglo-Saxon added the suffix ingus, it basically refers to the name of the leader or follower of that hero or that leader. So, for example, if it is Hastingas, it basically means followers of Hasta and refer to the place in which they lived. So, thus, the modern place names called Hastings was originally the place where Hasta and his followers lived. So, this is the very peculiar but significant kind of names that they had, the place names. So, that's something that is important. So, now let us go back to the Jutland warriors, the two Jutland warriors who were actually invited to come over to the land to do away to literally obliterate and massacre the Picts and Scots, and they were Hengist and Horsa. You find Hengist and Horsa, the warriors of Jutland, who came to Britain with their followers in response to the call of the British King Vortigern, found it very easy to literally beat back the Picts and Scots who were threatening. But contrary to the belief of Vortigern, the Jutland warriors or the Jute warriors, they had no intention of returning to their cold and infertile homeland. So the fertile countryside and the mild climate of Britain attracted them so much that they preferred to make the island their home. So Vortigern had made, he committed a huge, I would say, mistake by inviting the Jutland warriors, because once the Jutland warriors came over and once um, they came to the land, they realized that this land was far better than their own cold, infertile land, and they decided not to go back to their land but to make this land, that is the shores of Britain, their land. So it was a huge mistake, and you find that they refused to go back to Jutland, and a great battle was fought in 455 AD. Now, in 455 AD, the very same king who had actually invited these Jutland warriors ended up fighting with these Jutland warriors. And in 455 AD, in the war, in the battle, King Vortigern was killed. And once he was killed, it left, Hengist. So was Horsa leaving Hengist the undisputed king. So Horsa was also killed, and Hengist became the undisputed king. Having captured power, the Jews settled down in the land. Their families and dependents arrived, and they made the kingdom of Kent their home, driving the inhabitants to the north and west, where they found refuge like all the others who had been displaced at various times. Thus, the settlement of the Germanic tribes had begun. So you find when you talk about the Anglo-Saxon invasion, it actually begins with the Jutland warriors Hengist and Horsa. They were invited by King Vortigern, and very soon they realized that the British shores were much better than their own land, and they decided to stay here. They fought a battle with King Vortigern, and in 455 AD, Vortigern was defeated, and Hengist became the undisputed king. And very soon they call their extended family over to the land, and soon their families they arrived in ships, and they settled down in the kingdom of Kent. And like the other invaders before them, when they arrived, Jutland warriors, when they arrived, what happened to the previous inhabitants? They drove those inhabitants, remember, to the north and to the west. So, when the Celtic tribe came, what happened to the previous tribe? What happened to the Iberians? They were driven to the north and the west. And when the Romans came, the same thing happened to the Celtic tribes. Now the Romanized Britons were settled there, and with the arrival of Anglo-Saxons, the Romanized Britons were again driven to north and west. So now we are going to talk about the next set of invaders. So the next band of invaders were the Saxons, who came around the year 477 AD. So from 455 to 477, you have the Jutland warriors. Now from 477, we have another band of invaders. They were called the Saxons, and they were actually led by their leader Aela, and they are said to have arrived in three ships. And even though they did meet with some kind of resistance from the people that were occupying the land, you find that they were quite, I would say, strong, and they're quite versatile. They were really strong people. So you find that, however, they were no match for the wild and energetic Saxons, and several battles were fought and won by the Saxons. Now, many of those who resisted were either killed in the battle, or, of course, as usual, they fled into the mountainous north or the swamp-filled west. So the ones who remained were enslaved by the conquerors, who brought their families and settled in different parts of Britain, giving these settlements their own name. So the Anglo-Saxons, the Saxons here, they came under the leadership of the leader Aela. They arrived in three ships. Even though they did meet resistance, they were very strong. So they quelched all these so-called resistance. People who did not really want to, subdue and submit themselves, they were killed. So they had two options: either be killed or run away to north and to the swamp-filled West. The ones who did not really want to fight, not capable of fighting, they were enslaved by the Saxons. And the Saxons, just like the Jutland warriors, you find they brought their families and they settled in different parts of Britain. And when they settled down in different parts of Britain, they renamed these places. They gave these settlements their own names. So you find that the Saxons, they kept coming in large numbers, one after the other. They kept coming in large numbers, and they settled down mainly in the southern country of Sussex. The southern country of Sussex, where they thrived and prospered. Now you have to understand where they came and settled. So the East Saxons, within them, of course, you have divisions. So the East Saxons, they settled down in an area and they named that place as Essex. The Middle Saxons, they came and stayed in an area which they named, renamed, and they called that area Middlesex and Surrey. Now the West Saxons, they settled in place which came to be called as Wessex. Now Wessex consists of Berkshire, Wiltshire, Hampshire and Dorset. So this is how the Saxon warriors came and invaded the land, and wherever they came and settled, they renamed those places. So East Saxons, they settled down and they called the place Essex. Middle Saxons, they established in areas and they called those areas Middlesex and Surrey. West Saxons, they settled in place and they named that place Wessex. East Saxons, Essex. Middle Saxons, Middlesex and Surrey. West Saxons in Wessex. So, yeah, that is quite easy to remember. Now you find the next set of invaders. So first you have the Jutland warriors. Next you have the Saxons. And then finally you have the Angles. So another important tribe to invade the land was the Angles. Like their Saxon kinsmen, Angles also came from South Denmark, North Germany and Holland. So just like the Saxons who came from Denmark, Germany and Holland, the Angles too, they came from these areas. Now their leader was a strong brawny man called Ida. And like their kinsmen, the Jews and Saxons, they established themselves in certain well-marked areas like Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. They were more numerous, and therefore it was fitting that the land they occupied should be called Angle land or the land of Angles, which later became England and finally settled into the name England. So you find the next group of invaders were the group called Angles. And the Angles, just like the Saxons, that is their kinsmen Saxons, they came from South Denmark, North Germany and Holland. And they were led by a brawny man, but nevertheless he was strong, named Ida. So when they came, they settled down in areas, three areas, that is Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia. And because Angles as a tribe, they came in large numbers, and because their numbers were so large, you find that this land came to be later known as Angle land, land of Angles, because they were quite in number. And later on, this Angle land became England. So you find the Germanic invaders found it very easy to conquer Britain because Britain was left defenseless. But it did not mean it was very easy. It was comparatively easy to occupy and invade England But it was not always an easy or a walkover victory, because you find Britain did put up a strong defense against the marauders, which spread over a period of 100 years. That is, from 450 AD to 550 AD, you find there were resistance, there were some form of resistance and fights, and you do hear about you do hear names of certain, I would say, Britain leaders or warriors or heroes. And if you look at it, you find one particular mention, that is of Ambrosius Aurelius. So when we talk about British leaders who actually tried to defend the land against the so-called Anglo-Saxons, you do find mention of a particular hero or leader, and that is Ambrosius Aurelius. And again, let us look to one one true record, historical record, and that is of Venerable Bede. So, in Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history, you find there is a mention of one leader called Ambrosius Aurelius. But even this historical personage has a life story that is steeped in legends and myths, which are part of the very psyche of Britain. We find the figures of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table surface here. So you find stories of King Arthur, his land Camelot, his knights. All these are stories that basically surface. And Gildas is another historian. Gildas, remember Nennius and Gildas, one of the earliest historians of Britain, speaks of Arthur as the defender of Britain who engaged the Saxons in 12 battles, which culminated in the Battle of Mount Badonis, fought in the year 500 AD. So, when we talk about uh, leaders, you find both Bede, Venerable Bede, and the earliest historian Gildas, they do mention this one particular leader, Ambrosius Aurelius, and there are a lot of stories associated with this leader. There is this idea of King Arthur and his knights, the round table, and you find this King Arthur who could, be a sort of a, uh, you know, uh, I have to say, a mythological figure who defended Britain against the Saxons. So there is a talk about 12 battles which were fought between the Saxons and this mythological figure of King Arthur, and it basically culminated in the Battle of Mount Badonis, and this is in the year 500 AD. So now this battle inflicted such a crushing defeat upon the Saxons that they did not fight for another 50 years. However, by the end of this period, the British defense died down, and the shadowy figure of Arthur describes the history of Britain. And yet, there are no reliable records about the identity of King Arthur. Now, you understand that they sometimes believe that this King Arthur is only a sort of a imaginative or even an alter ego of Ambrosius Aurelius. Some believe that Ambrosius Aurelius is King Arthur. But then there are other legends and stories where King Arthur is believed to be true, to be another king, but we do not know. We do not know whether it is true. Yet you find the idea of King Arthur, gives or gave their people a sort of hope. And King Arthur to date remains to be considered, a sort of a true king, the only perfect king. I'm sure you would have heard of King Arthur, his best friend, Lancelot, the 12th Knight, the search for the Holy Grail. So there are a lot of stories that go into this legend of King Arthur. So let us consider this only as a legend, because there are um, no specific records about King Arthur. Most of the historians, most of them, they believe that this is only a legend, it is not real.
But there are a lot of stories like you have Thomas Mallory has written a work called Morty Arthur, Death of Arthur, and you find literature, English literature basically has a lot of stories where you have this medieval figure of King Arthur, his lady Guinevere, his friend, mm, his right hand man, Sir Lancelot. You have the story of Mordred, uh, the magician Merlin. So there are a lot of stories that you hear about. This is the vulnerable bead. So these are all legends associated with the figure of King Arthur and his round table. You have Lady Guinevere, Sir Lancelot, and here you have Merlin the magician and all his knights. So here you can see how they basically settle down. Angles, Saxons, and Jutland warriors. So Jutland warriors, these are the areas that they settle down in. This is where the Saxons settle down. East Saxons, Essex, Middle Saxon, Middlesex, and South Saxons, Sussex. And here you have Angles. So little by little, the Britons had to surrender to the energy and resolution of the Saxons. By about 7th century, the Saxons were well and truly masters of the land. However, the north and the west continued to elude them also, as they had for the Romans. The Britons, who could not accept them as masters, fled to the north and west. Many settled down in a life of peaceful submission to the Saxons. Others crossed the English Channel. Remember, others crossed the English Channel and settled in France, north of River Loire, in a place called Armorica. So you find that Britons had two options. They could either surrender to the Saxons or they could flee. So Britons who could not really accept Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons as masters, they fled to north and west. As most of them, of course, they submitted, they were subdued by the Saxons. Now there were others who did not really go to the north and the west. There were others who actually chose to leave the country altogether. So they settled in France. They settled in France in a place called Armorica. So Armorica was a place where all these so-called, Britons, they went and settled. And you find that this emigration continued, and you find there were a lot of people, a vast population. Majority of the so-called Britons, they chose not to go to north and the west. They preferred to move to this area in France that is called Armorica. And very soon this place was overrun by Britons. And hence the name Armorica was replaced by the name Brittany. Why? Because Armorica was no longer Armorica because it was filled with people from Britain, that is the Britons. So the name Armorica was replaced by the name Brittany. Brittany became to be known as the land of the self-exiled Britons. So it became a place for them to basically settle down. So the story of Arthur and his knights were brought to Brittany by the British emigrants where it remained for centuries. So you find that the story of King Arthur was taken to this land in France as well. That is Armorica, later known as Brittany. So these stories went to these lands as well, and it remained in those lands for over 2 centuries. So they were told and retold. Each time the story was told, there were a lot of changes. You find a lot of additions and exaggerations were used until it was used by Sir Thomas Malory. And once it was written by Thomas Malory, it was brought back to Britain and it has remained popular ever since then. So now the Britons who refused to accept the sovereignty of the Saxons or the self-imposed exile in Brittany, they retreated to the west, that is the Wild West. Now the west, of course, the green haunts of Wales, where their own forebears, the Celts, had settled centuries ago, having fled from the Romans. So now the Britons who could not accept, who could not accept the Saxon rules, they retreated. They retreated into the west. Now Wales, of course, it is called the Green Haunts. It is full of natural greenery. Remember, it is a swamp area. So the group who were not really ready to subdue, they did not want to accept the rule of the Saxons. So what they did was they basically moved away to the west of Wales. Now all those who lived in Wales, they began to call themselves the Cymry. They began to call themselves Cymry, meaning comrades. Now the land in which these comrades lived came to be called Cambria. So people who lived in Wales, they called themselves Cymry. Cymry basically means comrades, and land of comrades came to be called Cambria. Now the Cymry, they were united by the Christian religion, which survived the Saxon attack in Wales, and by their love of music and poetry. So when the Saxons arrived in Britain, you find the Britons already had a language that had passed from mere utilitarian purpose into flowery world of literature. So you find the Cymry in Wales had to face troubles and hardships over the century, but they jealously guarded their heritage of poetry and religion. So when the Saxons attacked Wales, or when the Saxons attacked the land, you find by then these so-called people had already had a clear idea. They had a strong sense of religion and literature. They had good language as well. They possessed good language. So you find that people, these primary, they were extremely possessive and protective about their music and their poetry and their religion. So they did not. So they basically kept away from the invaders. So they disdained any contact, literary or otherwise, with the invaders because they did not want to uh, somehow corrupt their culture, that is their religion, their poetry. So they basically kept away from their invaders, and you find constant exposure to savage nature made the Celts love her with true devotion. And these so-called Romanized Britons who had to move to Wales, they began to love nature and they began to adore and worship nature. Nature was a mother to them, sustainer, protector, and reformer. So their attitude was one of mysticism and a ready belief in things beyond the mundane, an attitude that is reflected in their literature. Now, this is an attitude that is shared by the Irish as well, perhaps because Ireland too was a refuge of the disinherited like the Cymry. So, just like people in Wales, you find people in Wales as well as the Irish, they too have this fondness, I would say, an aptitude for nature. and they consider nature to be some sort of a mother, a sustainer, and a protector and reformer. So they believe in supernatural things, and their attitude and belief can be seen in their literature as well. And this is something that you will find common with the Irish people as well, because of course people fled to different parts of England. So even in Ireland, you would find these Britons. They would have escaped to those lands as well. So now next, we're going to understand what happened uh, to the Saxons. So the years between the departure of the Roman legions and the arrival of the Roman monks saw a slow but complete revolution in the British Isles. Now, the Saxons had overrun the whole of Britain except the north and the west. Earlier, again, I kept telling you that the north and the west, it's too much for people to handle. So, the north, because of the mountainous terrain, and the west, mainly because of the swamps, were difficult to manage. So, they were basically left alone. So the Roman Britons who remained were either killed or enslaved by the Saxons. And remember, the Romans had taught them Latin language. So the civilized tones of the Latin language were replaced by the harsh and guttural Germanic accent of the Saxons. Now, with the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, you find their language also took, I would say, forefront or became more important, and they had a very harsh and guttural sort of accent when compared to the Latin language. Little or nothing of Latin or Celtic remained in Britain except for a few names. So you find that basically nothing remained of the Latin language or the Celtic except a few names, like the names of rivers, Us, Ax, and X are all forms of the British word iska, meaning water. So Us, Ax, and X, all of these these are the names of the rivers, and these names basically come from this, I would say, affix iska, which basically means water. So now, along with the Roman roads, these are the only reminders of Roman occupation of Britain. So the luxurious villa and the public bath and all that, everything was completely destroyed by the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the case is different when it came to the Saxon occupation of Britain. Place names are the best indicators, as seen in the presence of a number of place names which end with the suffix ings, as in Hastings. The suffix lay or lia denotes a clearing in the wood, and it's very common in place names which end in lay or lia. For example, place names like Alderley or Henley. So you find there was destruction of Roman cities of Britain. So that is what they believed in. So you find wide spread destruction of Roman cities, because Anglo-Saxons, they did not really want to live. They did not live, or they did not prefer living in luxurious villas, and they were not very happy with the marble baths of the Roman Britons. Now they were extremely superstitious, and they were afraid. They believed that these places would have ghosts, so they destroyed these places and nature took over. The Anglo-Saxons, they preferred to live in log cabins in Spartan simplicity, enjoying the smell of split oak which burnt in their hearts and brought sweet memories of their distant homeland. So you find they basically destroyed anything and everything that the Romans had built. Most of the Christian churches were destroyed, and the Anglo-Saxons continued to worship the gods of their land like Thor, Woden, Frigga. whose names have become immortal in the days of week. So you find the Saxons, they destroyed all the so-called Roman structures, buildings, baths, because they were superstitious. They believed that restless souls uh, would be there in all these structures. So they preferred Spartan life. They preferred living in wooden cabins, and they worshipped gods of their land. And if you look at the gods, we get the names of the week from the Anglo-Saxons, their faith, because for them, Woden basically is a god. And there you have Wednesday from the Lord of, this is another god of theirs, Thor, which again I'm sure you're familiar with. You have the name of the week, Thursday. Frigga is the mother of Thor, wife of Odin. Friday. So this is the kind of life that the Spartans led. Very simple sort of. So now, though robust and energetic, the Anglo-Saxons were not a bloodthirsty people. Now, after they plundered and their conquest was complete, they settled down to cultivate the land and they began to consider the island their own. So, despite this appearance of brutality, of being, a sort of a bloodthirsty invaders, you find that once they completely invaded the land, they began to, live, and they began to consider that land as their own. So the period or the history of England from this period, it is a continuous one. There are no more breaks and ruptures. And for quite some time, it remains to be a continuous period, despite a lot of calamities. So the Anglo-Saxons were clannish and they were loyal to their leaders. And one can trace the tradition of English monarchy as we know it now, can be traced back to this, can be traced back to the Anglo-Saxons. So once they settled down in the land, they submitted themselves to the rule of their leader, where again you can trace the beginning of the English law. So the land had begun to be demarcated into districts for ease in administration, and these demarcations continue by and large. Now, it is the character of a people that changed the course of history of their land. So, the Anglo Saxons, with their boundless energy and vigor, pleasure in life, living, his thirst for adventure, all these produced a race of man. They are they are projected as aggressive, with a lust of conquest, and you find that all these basically bring forward image of the English race. So with the Anglo-Saxons, you have a new race, the English race was born. Now we would be discussing, next class I will be discussing the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, how the Anglo-Saxons divided themselves into 7 kingdoms, and this is known as heptarchy. This period is called as heptarchy. As you can see,